Hi. As promised in yesterday's video, here's a talk on dependence and addiction. And by talk, I mean I will be speaking about these things. So, addiction and dependence are different. They might be used interchangeably in some cases, but they mean different things. Addiction, as we've discussed in the past, is a pattern, a compulsive pattern of conditioned behavior, which means that over the course of life, an individual has paired certain stimulus and response together, and conditioned themselves, made it expected in their brain that when one thing happens, another thing will follow. And over time, that becomes part of the autopilot mode of the brain and happens compulsively without intention, without conscious awareness, without thought, in a way. And so this often is in response to external stimulus or internal emotions and thoughts and reactions to external often. So there's usually some balance between external influences and then internal reactions that leads to using a behavior or a substance to address a feeling or a need or a perception of a need. When that becomes compulsive, then it qualifies, in my mind at least, as an addiction, somewhere along those lines. It includes conditioning a pattern of behavior or thoughts and compulsivity. And those are the hallmarks for addiction. Now, dependence might happen with addiction, doesn't have to, and it might happen without addiction. Now, dependence without addiction is less frequent, but it can still happen. So, dependence then is when the body becomes dependent. Define the word by using the word. Dependence meaning that without this thing, it can't function. So, the body becomes dependent on a substance in order to complete function. Commonly, we see this with opiates, alcohol, tobacco, nicotine specifically, caffeine, but pretty much any of the substances that are abused on a regular basis, not abused, used. We abuse ourselves with the use of something. You can't abuse something that has no life to it, which drugs don't have life to them. But we see it with these substances. It can also be with other things, I suppose, but those are the most common, and the ones I listed are the most easy to see. But I think that it is possible to enter into dependence with any kind of things we ingest, or so foods or drugs. Drugs being things that we consume that don't have nutritional value. That's my own personal working definition of a drug. But I think that behaviors can lead to dependence as well, patterns of behavior, when they engage certain body hormones or neurotransmitters, different chemicals in the body. But I'm not a neuroscientist. It's kind of me speculating here. I close my eyes to think, I suppose. So dependence then, the easy example is with opiates. Opiates are essentially a pain, we call it painkillers, but it inhibits the pain signal amongst the neural network of the body. And there's opiate receptors throughout the body, and the body creates its own opiates, endorphins. So the body has this natural flow of creating these pain-inhibiting, pain-blocking signals, and it releases if you injure your body in some way. And I think that can include just sensory overload, potentially. So like right now I'm sitting in a chair, and so I have a lot of points of contact with this chair, a lot of nerves they're sending signals of pressure to the brain. And pressure and pain are essentially the same thing. When you put pressure on a nerve, either really acute, so real fast and heavy amount of pressure, or low, slow, chronic, long-term application of pressure. But when you put pressure onto these nerves, it sends a signal. That's all it is. It's just something's touching me, essentially. It's touching me a lot, and it hurts. That's what pain is. Or it's touching a lot of elements, like you break your bone and there's a lot of nerve endings that have been either severed or damaged. A lot of inflammation occurs as the body's trying to repair itself and putting swelling and putting pressure onto nerve endings. And so you've got a lot of signals coming into the brain. Now the brain's going to release endorphins, and endorphins are going to slow or stop the signal from reaching the area of the brain that is going to feel what we identify as feeling of pain. So the body's constantly doing that, not to the extreme of breaking a leg, but it's constantly releasing endorphins to the body. And endorphins also have pleasurable effects. So it creates euphoria. So there's good things that can release endorphins, as well as pain events that can release endorphins. And pain, physical or emotional, in both cases, it can trigger endorphin release. So you've got the body's already producing endorphins, and then if you take an external version of that, so the endorphin, the thing that occurs in the body is called an agonist, and you have, I guess the agonist is the thing that mimics the thing that's in the body. So you have heroin is an agonist for an endorphin. It does the same function or close to the same function and binds to the same receptors. And you also have partial agonists, which are similar to but not completely, or not as much like, and they're going to bind to the same receptors and do some of the same job. And then you have antagonists, which bind to the same receptors and do the opposite effect. But for this purpose, was talk about. So let's look at heroin as an agonist for endorphins. Heroin is going to mimic the endorphin. If you use heroin, it's going to bind to the receptor and it's going to inhibit the pain signals. Now, if you don't have a whole lot of pain signals, you're mostly just going to enjoy the euphoria, because the binding to that opiate receptor is also going to create this feeling of pleasure, of good, of euphoria. And that's what being high is. It's that euphoria. So you can see how if someone has pain and they take this substance in order to reduce the pain, and they also have this euphoric feeling, and they like that euphoric feeling, they might want to repeat that process to get that euphoric feeling again. Or if the pain is so bad that they like to have the relief of pain, they're going to want to repeat that process to get rid of that pain. Now, if the pain is chronic, the pain is the trauma that's resulting from something traumatic in their past, then it is easy to see how the opiate, the painkiller, the pain inhibiting substance is preferred. Now, the way the body seems to work, like, I'm going to produce this thing, but if you're going to outsource it, I'm going to stop producing this thing, about conservation of energy. So I use this little analogy, and it's not really great, but I don't know, I've been using it for years now, so I'm just going to stick with it. Let's say that the opiate function in the body, the endorphin production, is like a shoe factory in a small town. I guess a large town, because we're talking about a high volume of shoe sales, but that's why it's not a good analogy. But I stick with it. So the endorphin production is like creating shoes. You got a shoe store in a town. The guy's making shoes, and he's providing shoes for everybody in the town, and everything's fine. But then someone, maybe an online retailer, comes along and says, "Well, we'll sell you your shoes. We'll ship them to you in 2 days for free, and we'll charge a little bit less." And so now everybody's going to this outsourced. They're outsourcing their shoe demand, and so the in-town shoe production guy is unable to keep up the business anymore because nobody's buying his shoes. So he closes down. He says, "Well, if you're going to buy them from them, then I'm not going to make shoes anymore." So he retires, closes up his shoe factory, and leaves. And he doesn't retire, but he's not producing shoes anymore. I don't know. My analogies get too deep sometimes, where I start to analyze every element of it. But so he stops making shoes. Everyone's buying shoes from the outsourced online retailer. And so the body's working the same way. If you start to bring in opiates from outside, then it's not going to create endorphins anymore, or it's not to the same effect. It's not going to need to. Or you've created a tolerance that the shoe store guy can't keep up with, that your body can't keep up with for the endorphins. And so in some element of both or all of it combined, but so whatever it is, either the shoe store can't produce enough to meet the demand, or it just shuts down altogether because there is no demand for it because it's being outsourced. Now, what if the online retailer shuts down? Now you don't have any shoes coming into the town. The guy's either can't keep up with it, or he's closed altogether. Now there's going to people are going to go without shoes as he gets his business going back to the volume that's necessary. And so that's what's going on with opiates. When you stop taking for heroin, for example, your body's going to go into withdrawals because it's no longer, it doesn't have the chemical that it's become dependent on. It was dependent on its own creation of, the body's dependent on its own creation of endorphins, but then it stops creating its own endorphins, so now it's become dependent on this outsource. Now if the outsource dries up or reduces, it's no longer meeting its need. It can't hit what it wants to have to feel normal. So it goes into withdrawals. And so what we see is the opposite of what the impact of the substance, what it does to the body. When it disappears, you get an opposite reaction of that. And don't quote me on that. It's kind of my interpretation of what I've been reading, and I don't want to 100% commit to that, but that's from my interpretation. That's what's going on. So you have to read about it, look at the specifics. So that was way more than what I was expecting to talk about here, but essentially, dependence occurs after prolonged exposure to a substance. In this case, we're going to use that for the example here. And addiction is the process, like the maybe more of a mental, but it is like it ties into everything mental is physical as well, because the brain is physical, and these things, as best we can tell, occur within the brain, the structure of the brain. So it's all physiological, but maybe addiction is more the compulsive pattern of behavior, whereas dependence is the physiological response to the substance being present. When you remove that, the body gets sick. But addiction also has withdrawal symptoms, and so you don't have to become dependent on the substance in order to go through withdrawals. Alcohol is at least the maybe the only one, but the most severe risk of withdrawal if you stop. And that's when I don't understand the alcohol dependence. I mean, I get it, but it's like opiates. I see the body creates endorphins, and then you take it away. But alcohol triggers the release of endorphins, so maybe the withdrawal has something to do with that. But also, I guess it's other neurotransmitters that are being affected. So, yeah. All right. So what are we talking about? Oh yeah. So you don't, even if you're not dependent on alcohol, but you stop using it, the pattern of behavior might be enough to make you feel physical symptoms of withdrawal, irritability, and stuff like that. I guess we would call that more mental, but it's still physical. But like you get the irritability, and maybe your mood's affected, your sleep patterns are affected, your appetite's affected. So some of these physical things are affected by the withdrawal process, even though dependence didn't occur. And so maybe you'll see that more with process addictions, behavioral things, playing video games too much, or sex addictions, or whatever else people can become addicted to physically, or like the non-substance related addictions. So I guess I'm going to wrap this up because the video is getting to the point where it's too long for me to transfer conveniently between this iPad and the computer. So addiction and dependence. Addiction can exist without dependence. Dependence can exist without addiction. And that, all right, so to clarify now, and that would be if you are on a medication for a period of time, prescribed, let's say, and then you're taking off of it and you go through a withdrawal phase, but you don't feel compulsively like I have to take this thing, or it was never about treating an attachment disorder or some kind of emotional pain or injury. It was strictly like you break a bone, your doctor prescribes you an opiate for the pain, you take it through the course of the healing process, you're healed, and then you stop taking it, you might feel a little sick after stopping it, because you've been on it for a period of time, your body's become dependent on it. But typically that doesn't happen unless there's fluctuation in the way that you take the dose. If you take a similar dose every day, your body shouldn't adjust too much to the tolerance or create a tolerance to it, and in which case you wouldn't experience withdrawals. But again, I'm a little off on that, but there's more that goes into it than to become an addiction versus dependence. But did I clarify anything or make it more confusing? Let me know. I think that I hit on all the points there. Essentially, addiction is the compulsive pattern of behavior. Dependence is the need for a substance in order to feel normal. Sometimes they exist together, sometimes they don't. You can have one without the other, and vice versa. Either one can exist without the other, but they can also exist together. And so, yeah, that's it. Addiction and dependence. And maybe this makes me think of abstinence versus sobriety. So maybe I'll cover that in a topic in a similar fashion coming up soon. But thanks for watching, and have a nice day. Or don't, your choice. But since it's your choice, why not choose a good one?